Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this panel about food history. I'm very glad that there are so many of you. I think it's going to be very interesting. We have an extraordinary panel, and I'll introduce everybody in a second. Today's event is to discuss why food history, why do we still care, why should we know more about it? But it's also the occasion to celebrate the US launch of those 6 books over there. Actually, after, if you want, to check it out. That's the cultural history of food that all of us have been working on for the past 3.5 years. It's been a pretty long project, very interesting, but I'll tell you more about that. I would like, first of all, to tell you a few things about our food studies program here. It's relatively new. We started in 2008, and right now we have about 20 classes. All of the classes, by the way, are open to the general public. So if you're interested, just let us know and we'll send you the relevant information. But we have historians, people working in policy, people working in nutrition, a nice set of scholars, researchers, and professionals that are making the program grow and making it visible also, not only in New York, I must say, also nationally. Besides our classes, for us it's very important to organize events like this. This is the New School for Public Engagement. I mean, food studies is part of the New School for Public Engagement. So we really want to continue a conversation with the community about all sorts of issues. And we're going to have an interesting calendar. In April, we are having an event on Jewish food in all its global aspects. So there will be something about Italian Jewish food and Jewish food in Israel, Jewish food in New York. And then in June, there are going to be 2 events. One is about women chefs. So what does it mean for a woman to become a successful professional chef in today's world? And then another event about US drinks. So an exploration of a few traditional alcoholic drinks. But as I said, if you want more information, just leave us your email. We can send you the dates, the invitations. We'd be very happy to do that. Last thing before we start with the panel, as we want to continue this conversation with the public, we've launched a new website. It's called The Inquisitive Eater, and you can just check inquisitiveeater.com. And it's a website that we would like to become the center of debates and discussions and exchange of ideas. There is space for everything. We have photography, we have design, we have poetry, we have memoirs, and we have policy issues. So check it out. We do welcome external submissions. So if any of you feels like contributing, we'd be really happy to read your stuff. Here I see quite a few students, also of the new school. Keep that in mind. It's edited, so you can put that on your resume. So inquisitiveeater.com, and it's coming out really nice also. Thank you also to our editor here, Yves Turo. So for today's panel, let me explain you a little bit the project of this work. I was contacted in 2008 by Berg Publishers in England. I had worked with them previously, and they asked me if I wanted to take on that. Of course, I said, not by myself. That's not going to happen. And so I decided to get in touch with a person I had worked with in Belgium, Peter Scholiers, at the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels, because I thought it was important that we could work together also with European scholars. So the 2 of us became the general editors, and then we asked different people to become volume editors, and here we have Amy Bentley, who's the editor of the 6th volume, about the contemporary volume. So it's been interesting work. to get that published all at the same time, there are more than 50 contributors. You can imagine what sort of logistics that implied, but it's done. So we're very happy. And so on the occasion of the release in the US, we thought it would be a good idea to think a little bit about why are we doing food history right now. I actually wrote a column for the Huffington Post about that last week. So let me introduce the panelists. I introduce myself first. I forgot to do that. My name is Fabio Parasecoli. I am the coordinator of food studies here at the New School and the general editor of the Cultural History of Food. Here we have Michael Krondl. They're in a different order, but it doesn't matter. Michael Krondl, writer, specialist in food history. He's got different books on culinary history. The most recent is Sweet Invention, A History of Dessert. He also published on spices, very interesting material, and he's going to teach for us next year. We're very happy about that. Amy Bentley, that I have already introduced. She's associate professor at the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health here at NYU, our neighbors. She is a historian, and she's the author of Eating for Victory, Food Rationing and the Politics of Domesticity. That came out in '98. And right now she's working and completing a cultural history of baby food. That's coming out with University of California Press. She's also one of the co-founders of the Experimental Cuisine Collective, a very interesting experiment that's going on at NYU, a collaboration between food studies and chemistry, if I'm correct. So there's a lot of reflection about molecular gastronomy, what's going on right now in the food world. Then we have Paul Freedman. He's professor of medieval history at Yale. He's written especially on the Middle Ages, particularly on Spain, but over the last 10 years is really focused on food. Is the author of Out of the East, Spices and the Medieval Imagination, and the editor of Food, The History of Taste, that came out in 2007, a beautiful, beautiful book. If you happen to look at it, you understand what I mean. Then we have Amy Trubek. I'm very happy to have these people here because we will be working together for years, and so finally we're all together in the same room. But anyway, so Amy is associate professor in the Nutrition and Food Science department at the University of Vermont. She's trained both as a chef and as a cultural anthropologist. And she's very interested in history, and particularly she works on the history of culinary profession, and that's what we asked her to write about for these 6 volumes. She's also author of Haute Cuisine, How the French Invented the Culinary Profession, and The Taste of Place, A Cultural Journey into Terroir, which came out in 2008. And then we have Maya Joseph. She graduated from the New School for Social Research this year with a PhD in political science. And her dissertation, Outpacing Regulation, Technology, Democracy, and Animal Cloning at the FDA, deals with food regulatory agencies. It's extremely interesting work, and I'm also happy to say that she'll be back to teach for us next year a class on global food systems. So I'm really, really happy to have them here. And I'll start with the first question, the title of our panel. Why should we care about food history? Who want to go first? Amy?
I'll go first. Should I stand or? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Fabio and the New School people, for inviting us. This is such a great opportunity to talk about the books, reflect upon the process, and just think about the implications of food history. And I think the biggest answer to your question, why food history, why should we care, is probably the fact that so many people have turned out tonight. So obviously we do care. Why we care, I think, is because it's so relevant to all humans. All humans have to eat. Ideally, we can do it several times a day. And it's not just about sustenance and nutrients, but it's so embedded in culture and society, politics, economics, just really all facets of society. And, but it wasn't really articulated in traditional histories until recently. It was definitely embedded. It was always a part. I mean, if you look at military histories and political histories, food is a driving force from the earliest civilizations on. So it was definitely there, but it was not considered important in that earlier era of telling histories, which tended to focus on leaders, great men, people who were charismatic or who, for one reason or another, created events, led wars, were presidents. And until the rise of, the 60s, civil rights era, social history, kind of this understanding that everyday history mattered. Things that weren't just about important people and presidents were important, and everybody had a history. Even if you were illiterate and a peasant working on an estate, your history was important and mattered in the larger scheme of things. So kind of at that point, our idea about what was acceptable to write really broadened and deepened, and food was a benefit of that turn in social history, at least in U.S. history. I'm sure others can speak about European history and other kinds of history. And I think at that point in the 70s, 80s, 90s, topics began to open up. Women, ethnicity, ethnic minorities, food, especially the domestic realm, which wasn't considered as important as the public realm, became an opportunity to think about in historical terms. So I'll stop.
Maybe I could just add that for the period of the 60s and 70s, and even before in Europe, there was a great interest in the food of ordinary people, in problems like famine, food supply, school nutrition. What changed perhaps as late as the 90s was an interest in what people like to eat, in choice, in discretion, in the meals of people who were not poor, a topic that had been considered among historians kind of like amateur, or like the history of furniture or the history of fashion, not a professional topic. And I think the importance of choice and even of seemingly frivolous tastes owes a lot to the influence not only of thinking about ordinary people, but thinking about social class and discrimination. Ordinary people, people who think that they're not ordinary, people who aspire to be non-ordinary, people who eat certain kinds of foods that are considered prestigious, or reject foods that are considered not prestigious. And we have seen this change in our own time. Keeping chickens in your backyard was the mark of poverty 40 years ago, and now it's the mark of a certain kind of savoir-faire and sophistication. So I would advance one other reason besides sort of the social and cultural historical, and that is, and this is perhaps more narrowly within academic history, but the role of food in history is not just in wars, nutritional levels, but in things like the demand for sugar, or the desire for spices, or the lust for tea. All of these things move historical events, move the decisions of leaders, involve the migrations, forced or voluntary, of whole populations. Merely to put sugar into the tea of European drinkers, or sugar into the chocolate of European drinkers. And of course, it's not merely, it's really a phenomenon as important as political ambition in terms of actually what moves history, at least so it seems, I think, to many of us now.
I think I'm going to bring this away from the genuine import of food history on history, which I think is certainly relevant and pertinent. And yes, millions of people were enslaved because a few people in Europe liked having their beverages sweetened. I come from an art background, and I think one of the things that we are seeking in life is complexity rather than simplicity. And particularly in culture, we're looking at complexity. And if you can speak about the things that you are eating 3 times a day, 4 times a day, with a certain interest, a certain complexity, a certain, I don't know, just bringing in ideas that are maybe not immediate to the table or the food in front of you, it makes your life more interesting. So, you know, forget the utility for a moment, the utility of food history to understanding the history of humanity, to understanding the humanity of today. But think about it as the thing that, well, if you understand what you eat in a more complex way, it'll make your life more interesting. Think about looking at a painting. If all you do and look at the painting and say, oh, that's pretty, how interesting is that? If you go to a sports game and say, you know, oh, that guy can run fast, it's not interesting. We as cultured animals like to discuss everything. And that's what makes us culture. That's what makes us communicate. And if we can learn more about food from its historical standpoint, from its cultural standpoint, it makes dinner more interesting.
Okay, I guess we're standing. Okay. So yeah, to follow up on Michael's points, that one of the and on Amy and Paul, that I think that one of the reasons why food seems to matter so much right now, and food history therefore also matters, is that food simultaneously is an incredible way to understand the human condition, because it is ubiquitous and necessary and constant. And yet, in the United States in particular, at this moment in history, we are getting very interested in aesthetics in relationship to food, that somehow we are sort of saying food is more than nutrient. It is something bigger and more complex, and it has more to say about who we are and who we want to aspire to be, and about pleasure. And so I think that the frames for thinking about food are really expanding, and that for then our interest in food, therefore, in a sense, expands at the same time. And then history is, I think, really important for understanding food when you acknowledge its complexity, because you have to manage it somehow. I mean, food is, it's unbelievable if you think about just in your own life that you're going to be making at least 1,000 decisions of meal periods a year. And since we are a snacking culture, we have many more decisions we have to make. So I think that food history is really important if we want to understand our own cultural moment right now, that we're so fascinated by food, because we can get fascinated in a sort of solipsistic way. But if we use history, we can get a little bit more refined about our understanding and interest in food, and we can start to say, well, why has it been this way, or why is it this way now, and how did people used to organize themselves around food, and why in American culture were we so puritanical about food and now we're so in love with food? Or why did we think chickens were disgusting and now we think they should be pets? You know, there's all of these really interesting questions. So I think for me, it's that combination of the ubiquity of it and the complexity of it that make looking at food historically so important.
Thank you.
Well, I think I would come at this food is interesting and complicated and makes for good discussion perspective from a different angle. I think that it is suddenly so interesting to think about and look at and discuss and do histories of, because we don't know anything about it. And we've gotten to a point culturally where we really have no idea what we're eating. And so people can deconstruct the Twinkie and write books about fast food. And even with simple things like sugar, you go to the store and buy sugar, and whether it's in a box or a packet or a bag, it's this mysterious white powder. It's simple. Everyone knows what sugar is, but nobody knows where it comes from. It's probably grown on one of tens of thousands of acres in Minnesota, and it was probably originated as a really ugly sugar beet. But all of these things have completely escaped our modern thinking and understanding and knowledge of food. So suddenly, because we're so far removed from it in our daily life, there is this vast expanse of territory to go back and renegotiate and understand and explore. And so I think that's part of what makes it so exciting, is that we're just so far away from it. It's like a foreign country. And then on the question of why we should care about food, I actually have a question for my fellow panelists, if that's allowed. Because I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist, so all this history is a little new and exciting for me. So I'm wondering, is doing food history any different from doing any other kind of history? I mean, should we care more about food history than...
Eat better.
No, that's actually an interesting point, and that was a very good segue. We all come from different backgrounds, and that's what I think made that work interesting. What do you bring from your background to your work on food history, to your research, to what you've written also for those books? The methodologies, the approach, where do you come from when you do those things? Also including the political scientist.
Well, actually, I had planned to answer that a little bit in the reverse. So perhaps I could say something a little closer to what Maya raises, and that is, within the discipline of history, on the one hand, food history of the type that we're talking about is very, excites a lot of interest. On the other hand, at my own department, the best known scholars study American slavery, Cold War, European genocide, Cambodian genocide, and I have the feeling that my interests as they've evolved from medieval peasants and serfdom to restaurants in the modern era has to be regarded as frivolous. Well, I mean, I can do this because I have, older and have tenure. The question does often come up, would you recommend to a history PhD student that they try to make a career in this? And I'm not sure of the answer. I would tend to say yes, but not unreservedly. So it actually, and again, I would distinguish between history. I mean, of course, you would, if you're going to study American slavery or European genocide or Cold War, any of these subjects involves food or absence of food, but they don't involve preferences. They don't involve people, why is it that beef Wellington is popular at one point and not at another? Why, when did non-Italians in the United States start to eat spaghetti? These are not considered to be such serious questions. I don't want to take more time than I should. In terms of methodology, as a historian, you get used to just going exhaustively over small pieces of information. I think the ideas have to come often from other disciplines, and in this case, anthropology. I think what we've learned as historians from anthropology is immense, because there you do study the codes that people have, the way in which food choice, who gets to eat what, is a social code. And so I think that has been the most methodologically influential thing for me and for most of my colleagues.
Well, I think I don't want to speak for Amy Bentley, but as somebody who has been involved in the long process of doing research on food beginning, longer than maybe either of us want to say. The whole question of, is food history more important or less important? And then Paul's response is, it really depends on from what perspective you're taking. So if you are in an academic environment and the disciplines are the disciplining element of how you do research, okay, it doesn't matter more than any other human endeavor if you're trying to understand period and, and forces and, let's say political systems. I happen to come from interest in academic research on food from training in restaurants. And so I'm interested in food because I love food. So I get into these discussions all the time, and I say it lucky for us that we're now at a point in history, right, that you can be interested in food in a number of different ways, and you can then look at history to try to understand your own interest in food. So I think that it's important to study food because it hasn't been studied. So I think number one, why don't we know more than we do? And why are we just all realizing we need to know something? I mean, there's been a lot of smart people for a lot of years studying a lot of topics, and food is absolutely necessary, and we know very little. So I think for that reason alone, we should all study food. And because I like to eat, and I like to cook, so those are other reasons for me personally. But methodologically, it's very interesting because I'm sort of the opposite of Paul, that I am trained in cultural anthropology. So my background is, and my thinking is always anthropological, but I always end up in the past. I don't really know why, but it always happens to me. It's just the way I think. And I think it's partly because I agree with Roland Barthes, who said that there can be no culture without classification. That is a lot of the cultural act and the way that we humans operate in social organization is to classify, and there is nothing more fruitful to classify than food, because it is so necessary and ubiquitous, and it's a great way to differentiate. It's a great way to create solidarity. It's just really, really complex and rich in the social experience. So I think for me, as somebody who studied anthropology and classification, I wasn't happy with just seeing it in the moment, which is also the truth for right now. Like, I don't think we should just see our experience of food right at this moment as telling us everything that there is to know about food. We're at a particular moment, we think chickens are cool. We didn't think chickens were cool 25 years ago, and we may hate them again in 25 years. Maybe with the avian flu, they might all be dead. So, we don't know what's going to happen with the chickens. So, there's just so much that can mutability in classification. And I think that I'm interested in both classification and the mutability, and food both lends it to looking at those kinds of questions, and also actually food makes both of those things happen all the time. So. Oh, you have it.
Well, in terms of methodology, I've been trained as a political scientist, I've been trained to study institutions mainly, and how they change over time and how they're influenced by political and cultural systems and how they in turn influence them. So I suppose that's how I approach the study of food and its history. In terms of this Berg piece, I think I was really influenced by Amy Bentley, actually. Her insistence that my co-author Marion Nessel and I take a comparative perspective, I think absolutely influenced how we went about doing the writing of the piece and looking at the history, because a lot of times I think when we start talking about food history in the US, it's very US focused, especially, there's so much to say about the Farm Bill and the history of the USDA and the FDA. And so we were writing about this, and I think at one point she said something to the effect of, okay, we know what's happening in the US, but what about the rest of the world? And so we looked at China.
I recall I said that very gently.
And so we looked at China and the Soviet Union and Africa and all these other places where things are completely different, and to be able to look at the rest of the world's institutions and how they structure food systems profoundly influenced the way I thought and wrote about the American food system, because as horrible as the American Farm Bill is, and as terrible as the effects of some of the USDA policies are in the United States, they come out looking really, really good in comparison to things that China did, for instance. And so I think a comparative perspective is actually something I definitely recommend for food historians.
I want to build on a little bit what Paul said about traditional academic history. And I think there has been, and still is to a certain extent, a tension between popular history for a general audience and academic history. And I think that's for a variety of reasons, and it kind of comes out with regard to food, because food is such a great topic. Food is such a topic of great interest for the general public. And that's because, again, everybody has experience with food. Everybody's grandmother made baklava or rugula, or something that has some concrete, tangible relation to themselves and their own history. So a lot of good general popular histories are written and have been written by amateur historians. And I think that academic historians who are from kind of a more traditional mold get nervous about that, and there are various reasons why. There's standards and there's methods and there's burdens of proof, and it's almost like two different kinds of histories that are being written with different goals and different conventions. And so there's some tension there that I think comes out with regard to food history, as well as it being a topic that isn't like genocide. And so one has to always kind of defend one's taking on of the topic. As far as methods, I would agree. Anthropology, folklore, those disciplines that take seriously everyday life and everyday existence, I think are the ones that food historians have learned a lot from, and I certainly have. And when I was in graduate school, I was in an American Studies program, which was interdisciplinary and very culturally oriented. But nobody really did food. Nobody really thought about food. And I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I was interested in World War II as a interesting moment of a lot of things going on. And I was interested in gender as a topic. And so I was looking around for a topic that had to do with gender in World War II, and I didn't really want to do Rosie the Riveter because that had been done. And I thought of my mother's stories of her family in World War II, where they had a victory garden and they saved fat in a can on the back of the stove, and they would turn that in to make explosives. All of these things that had to do with food. And so I was in the National Archives looking for material, and I asked the archivist, well, do you have anything on victory gardens? And he said, well, I don't know, let me go check. And he walked away and then came back a little bit later, rolling a huge cart full of boxes and boxes of materials. He said, wow, I found so much, and I'm not sure anyone's looked at this stuff before. And this was a very exciting moment. And from that, my dissertation turned into a domestic U.S. history of food rationing in World War II. And the food part just excited me and just was so compelling. It really became the focus of the study, much more than, the backdrop was war and gender, obviously. But as I was working through my dissertation and later turned it into a book, I realized what it really was. I was working out issues with my mother, as we all do, right? This is all. So I realized, this may or may not be relevant or important or even interesting, but I realized that my mother, who is and was a wonderful mother, was a traditional stay-at-home mother and cooked 3 meals a day for her whole life and nourished me wonderfully and nourished my sisters and my dad wonderfully, but was the primary provider. And I was very grateful, and also I did not want to do that, and I felt very guilty about that. And I was in this quandary about feeling like I wasn't appreciative of all of the wonderful work and skill that she did in feeding me. And so I realized what my dissertation was, because it focused on women food providers in World War II, which was a little bit earlier than her time period. But I was writing a book about women like my mother, who got up, shopped, put food on the table, cooked, gleaned, fed their families and didn't get glory from it and didn't, become famous for it. And so I feel like that was just that's a good example of, food history having a power and a resonance with people that is true and is relevant, I think, for everyone.
I think I want to get back to Paul's point, which was more or less how you can't make a career writing about food as a PhD student in the history department. What's funny about that, of course, is you could make a fabulous career in the art history department writing about Rococo painting, which is probably the most frivolous thing imaginable, but there's absolutely no problem working your way up through academia writing about something like that. So I think part of the problem that food history has had for the last, 20 years or so that it's existed, 30 years or so, is categories. It doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite fit into cultural studies. It doesn't quite fit into the study of art. It doesn't quite fit into the study of anthropology. And because it sort of floats along, and yes, American studies perhaps, but even American studies, okay, well, what if you want to study, the food culture of, you name it, right? It doesn't fit into American studies. And so to some degree, it is actually amateurs, non-professionals, who have stepped into the breach because they're not worried about making tenure. So there's been probably vastly more written by amateurs about the history of food than professionals. I mean, maybe not vastly more, but a great deal. So that's one of the problems, and I don't quite know how to solve that. Maybe having a Department of Food Studies at the New School is the way to solve that. I also find the idea of the comparative approach really, really interesting, mainly because that's what I do, so obviously I find it interesting. And so not only do I come from a sort of an art background, I also happen to be Czech and live partially in Canada, partially here. And so I find it interesting to look at those cultures that maybe aren't represented so much in the food history mainstream. If you look at the food history mainstream, it's about France, it's about England, which I always think is hilarious, and it's about the United States. There's a little bit about Italy, nowhere near as much as there should be, given Italy. There should be vastly more about Italy than the United States when you stop to think about it. But there isn't. The Germans write about themselves, but nobody here hears about it. Pardon? South America, South Asia, East Asia. I tried to do some research on South Asia, the food customs there. There's nothing written in English, virtually. And yet, academics in India write in English. So it is a young field which is really exciting. But I think we do need to open up to the world. There is a whole bunch of billions of people out there, and they have a fascinating food history.
My next question is, so far we're looking at the nice aspects of food history, how it helps us understand ourselves, what we like, our past. But very often, food history can also be used to deceive. And I'll give you an example that is very close to where I come from. I'm from Italy, and we have a political party called the Northern League that came out with the theory that they should succeed from the rest of the country. They want to be independent. The North should be independent from the South. So how do they justify that? They say that while the rest of Italy descends from the Romans, they descend from the Celts. And so they show up, with helmets and horns at political rallies and whatnot. But interestingly, they're using food for their political argument. So they organize festivals on the street where they prepare and offer polenta, sort of like, grits, polenta. And they also produce posters that said, yes to polenta, no to couscous. Interestingly, talking about food history, couscous has been in Italy since more or less the 9th century. Polenta came only after, after Columbus arrived here. So it's interesting that, you know, they're completely illogical and inaccurate from the historical point of view, but their point is not history. It's actually propaganda. So I'd like to launch this question, you know, examples or way in which history and food history can be used as propaganda or as ways to cover reality for various reasons.
I think the subject of stories people telling themselves about their food is absolutely fascinating. And I sort of phrase it that way because people build cultures by telling each other stories about each other. So a nation state, to some degree, is created by a bunch of people in that nation state saying, we are like this. The French tell each other, this is how we eat. And of course, the French are especially obsessed with talking to each other about how the French eat. And of course, this is the way civilized people eat. I remember reading something about medieval Baghdad and the people in medieval Baghdad talking about, I'm sorry, not medieval Baghdad. This is in the ancient Sumer, so forget medieval Baghdad, 3,000 years before today. Talking about how the people in the desert, oh, they're such peasants, they wouldn't know how to make a cake properly. So it's always about us and them. And yours is, of course, the perfect example. Another example from Italy, if I may add it, is that the people in Venice insist on eating white polenta, whereas the people on the mainland eat yellow polenta. And of course, the people in Venice think that they're peasants for eating yellow polenta, in much the way that there's a distinction in the United States between the North, where people eat white cornmeal, and the South, where people eat yellow cornmeal. Or do I have that backwards? Either way. But I think that, you know, I guess I'm an unreconstructed, whatever that term is, postmodernist, because I really think those stories are much more interesting than the facts. Because yes, there's all sorts of lies told about these things, but really, if you tell your Northern Leaguer, no, you've got your facts right, does it really change anything? It doesn't. But if you start examining why they're creating those myths, I think that becomes more interesting. So I don't think it's so bad.
So yeah, one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about in that way is, this is that anthropological perspective, is in the human experience, we can use food to bring people together, or we can use food to differentiate ourselves from people, so that, you know, us, them, food is extremely convenient for an us, them kind of dichotomous type approach to dealing with people that are unfamiliar or somehow you're uncomfortable with or you want to oppress in some way. But I will say that when you talk about why food history is important and how food history can be used, I have to say that my idealism is about how food brings people together. I'm a sucker for commensality and sociability and food and all that. I'll go down that path anytime that anyone wants to get me there. But I also have read all of this anthropology about food rules, and we are really good at food rules too, and rules of inclusion and exclusion. And if anybody's read Mary Douglas, she's particularly good at this. And I have to say that I have been very struck in the last five years in particular. I live in Vermont, which is an amazingly beautiful place and is a little bit of a ground zero for the sustainable food movement. And I have been a little shocked at the extent to which the sustainable food movement, to me, very much falls into these rules of inclusion and exclusion, and also can be very ahistorical about why we eat what we eat and how we eat it. And so I would say that I think not food history, the past can be used to justify the present, and then the present can conveniently forget the past when it wants to, when we want to sort of make claims about ourselves and sort of make ourselves different from other people. So, for example, you know, the notion of, are you an ethically superior person if you eat organic food? And if somebody isn't eating organic food, you know, what does that mean about them versus you? These are the kinds of things that can getting played out on an everyday basis in certain parts of the United States, and anyway, I think it's just a really fascinating. I think we're always sort of moving between that food, these different ways that we bring ourselves together and push ourselves apart from each other, and food happens to be really good for both.
All right, no problem. We're almost, it's almost 7, and we want always to leave time for question and answers. Just one last quick question. If you have, where do you think food history will go? It will go more into academia, or will stay into the general public? It will become more relevant for the general public? Will it go on TV? Just what do you think about that? Any ideas?
My answer is yes.
I think that the point that Michael made before about the professional, I don't think it's professional amateur. I think it's people who write about food in an academic setting and people who write outside. And of course, as you know quite well, there are people who do both. And so I think that there's a fruitful interchange in that, at least. I think that there are people who do different kinds of research, different kinds of syntheses, different kinds of ideas. I think within academia, despite what might have sounded like a pessimistic account of history departments, I don't think there's any doubt that this is going to become much larger. The American Historical Association actually wants to have a handbook of how to teach food history, that the two Amy's are contributing to, and I'm one of the editors of and contributing to as well. They are scheduling sessions on food history, admittedly, in the next meeting. Admittedly, it's in New Orleans, and that perhaps stimulated them to do that. But so I don't think there's any doubt that it will become a more important topic within the field of history. How it profits from, that is, the academic side profits from the non-academic side is really visible in teaching students. Certainly for me, since most of my teaching over 30 years has been in medieval history, I'm usually secure in the sense that I know much more about medieval history than undergraduate students. But in teaching food history, there's a lot that the students know that I don't, and that that cliche about learning from your students that I would have said I'd been fairly cynical about, I really have experienced every time I've taught such courses, so that I think that the academic interest extends beyond the normal kinds of fairly narrow authorities or list of things that you should know. And I expect that only to grow in the future.
I would agree as well, and I hear very frequently about departments, academic departments, universities across the nation starting interdisciplinary food programs, whether it may not be a bona fide department, but it's a group of professors from different fields who are putting together a list of courses and are starting a colloquia, or in the case of Drexel University starting a program about the urban environment, water, food, and engineering. I mean, something that's much more coming out of the hard sciences. And this is all just very, very exciting to me. I think what it's doing is it's pushing even further traditional academic boundaries so that there's more interdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary thinking. I mean, food is just a marvelous topic to explore from multiple perspectives. Botany, science, environment, nutrition, culture, politics, economics. I mean, it's got it all. And so it's, to use as a single focus, there's so much you can do and so many people you can bring in. It's hard to do really good interdisciplinary work across the humanities and the sciences, but I think that the effort is really encouraging and productive. And I think what I see my role in as I talk to these people who are starting departments, and because NYU has been around for a while, frequently I'll get people asking, to talk about our experience, and I feel very strongly that history is a part of that interdisciplinary study, that we just can't look at it without that perspective of change over time and really understand where we are without that history. So I'm on a little mini campaign to, when these programs develop these interdisciplinary food programs, to make sure that history is definitely a part of it.
All right, so we'll start with questions and answers. Wait for the microphones, otherwise we're recording, and if you don't speak in the microphone, people won't hear you.
I have two related questions. The first is that our food is becoming denurtured. Fruit once had seed, like oranges and watermelons and things once had seeds, and we're hybridizing the seeds out and reducing the nutrition. Is that a modern phenomenon? Or has anything like that ever happened historically? The second thing is food processing, the way we've known it in the 20th and 21st centuries, I think is historically unique. I don't think people ever ate processed foods in the past, and I wanted to know if that's true, and what the what the implication of that is likely to be. Thank you.
Anybody wants to answer?
I'd like to answer the food processing part of that, because I certainly don't think that foods have ever been processed in the way that they are now, with the specific ingredients and additives and the things done to them that they are now. But if you look at it from the standpoint of food adulteration, then I think this is just one more example of something that's happened throughout history. If you look at, for instance, the laws governing food production throughout from say the 1900s back through the Middle Ages, there are so many that concern bakers and millers and other people responsible for preparing or producing food, specifying what can and what cannot go into the food. So millers, for instance, used to add other things to their milled flour to buff up the weight. So they could say, here's your pound of flour, and it would have all kinds of noxious ingredients that were deadly to people, or maybe not deadly. Some of them, were completely innocent, but they certainly weren't wheat flour. So in that sense, I think it's just one more instance in a long history of terrible food practices.
I think there's a danger, and this is a danger that comes from not knowing the history, of romanticizing the past. And if you look at the history of the West, just looking at the history of the West for the moment, if you go before 1850, famines were a constant thread throughout pretty well everywhere but North America. The peasants did not have an interesting, complex diet with flavorful food. They ate polenta for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They might get a little bit of buttermilk. They were constantly dying of diseases of malnutrition. We are an incredibly privileged society where we can say, oh, well, these processed foods aren't quite as nice as the stuff that we'd like to, that we buy at Whole Foods, or quite as nice as the stuff we buy at the farmer's market, and that's certainly true. But if you look at 90% of the population of medieval Europe, they were barely surviving, and their nutrition was way worse than 90% of the American population. They were dying at what age, Paul? Not very old. Although I think I would certainly prefer to eat the food from the, from the farmer and from the farmer's market. I would prefer not to eat the processed food. That processed food is a heck of a lot better than most of what most of the world has been eating throughout history.
No, I just wanted, what I actually wrote about in the cultural history of food was labor, cooking as labor and food. And I will say that I think that to make food palatable for people, and we have to labor at it. And it is always more dangerous when somebody else does the labor for you, but most people want to figure out how somebody else could do it for them so they can watch TV or write manuscripts in calligraphy or whatever it is. So I think it's a constant battle in human history between the sense of knowing and security and safety and danger, and a lot of it has to do with what we ourselves are going to do and what we're going to let other people do to our food.
And I think maybe what you're hinting at is that, processed food is definitely a step up from what used to be in the general food supply. But now we in this developed country have so much processed food that is generally low in nutrition and high in calories and fat, and just the circumstances of our society today is creating a population of quote unquote well-fed people who may not be who may be malnourished and are suffering diseases of excess rather than diseases of viruses or diseases that needed medicine. So we're in this particular moment where we're suffering from excess, the diseases and the problems of excess, even as half of the world is still suffering from not enough food. So it's this paradox that Raj Patel and others have talked about being stuffed and starved, that half of the globe is stuffed and half of the globe is starved. And so what are the solutions to those? It's very complex, huge, problematic. We need to put all our brain power toward it to solve some of these problems.
Hi, I wanted to go back to the idea of our drive to complexity that was brought up at the very beginning. And the question that I have also follows yours well. It's about processed food. And it's about our drive to simplicity rather than complexity, or our drive to have less complexity in the foods that we eat. When I think about American cultured foods, I think about ease, quick foods, microwave meals, meat and potatoes, literally simple sugars versus complex sugars. So I see so much more of a drive towards simplicity than complexity, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
I'll just briefly speak to it because I guess I brought up that subject. I think that if you look at the flavor profile of most processed food, you've got sugar, salt, greasy. There may be 500 ingredients in it that you can't pronounce, but the flavor profile is very, very narrow. There's very little bitterness to it. There's very little aroma to it that's not a synthetic kind of sweet aroma. So although I do understand what you're saying, a simple carrot has more complexity in flavor than a bag of chips.
I think that the simplicity that is prized now is the carrot that tastes like a real carrot. So if that's what you mean, then yes, I think the American taste has recently rediscovered basic ingredients. I think irrespective of the technology, what has been valued in the food industry and its advertising in the last 120 years is complexity in the sense of variety. So you can get a dozen yogurt flavors. The yogurt isn't very good, but it comes in many, many forms. You can get industrial orange juice in many different options. You can get all sorts of things. I mean, the way of changing the subject of, well, this isn't very good is, well, but it comes in 35 different varieties. I think the emphasis on simplicity then is actually very important and not merely an affectation. Because if you say, this ice cream is better even though it only comes in 4 flavors than another more industrial ice cream that comes in, say, 32 flavors, that's a real change, though there is always, where the complexity comes in American taste and diet is in ethnic variety. So it's unusual in most of the world to say something like, well, I don't want to have Italian food because I had it for lunch. I think most people in most parts of the world have a fairly consistent cuisine, rather than assuming that, therefore, I ought to have Japanese food for dinner because I had Italian food for lunch.
I also think there's a distinction to be made between complexity and variety. It's kind of like television, 500 channels and there's nothing on, because it's all kind of the same. And same thing, you look at your supermarket aisle, yes, there are 80 different kinds of breakfast cereal, but they're all kind of the same.
I actually have 2 questions. One is for the gentleman in the brown. Michael, thank you. I just wanted to know, because you really stressed on amateur writers, what do you consider an amateur food writer? And how would you distinguish a book written by an amateur versus one in academia?
It was probably a terrible choice of words. So I take it back. I'd much rather go with Paul's definition, which is people writing within academia and outside of academia. That's a much, much better way of phrasing it. So excuse me for that use of that particular word. If I do want to use that word, it would be the 19th century sense, where I think an amateur was a lover of food.
I just wanted to know, do you believe history of food will help us learn more about the history of human evolution?
Yes. I'm sure, did she talk about this new book by Richard Wrangham about how cooking made us human? I don't know.
No.
Yes, I think that there are lots of different arguments, and you might have gone over them, bipedalism and the opposable thumb, and there's lots of ideas about what made us uniquely human, but there is an anthropologist who's now looking at the problem solving of going from raw food to cooked food as being very pivotal in human evolution. So there is a lot of evidence for that.
What was the book again?
Isn't it? Catching Fire. Catching Fire.
We have
There's a question over here.
lady over there.
I have a question for Dr. Krondl about school nutrition and how far back those type of studies go back in Europe, or what types of writings are about them.
About nutrition?
School nutrition, that was brought up.
I'm sorry, what sort of nutrition?
School nutrition.
School nutrition.
Oh, that Dr. Freedman brought up. Dr. Freedman brought up about school nutrition in Europe.
Histories of school nutrition?
Yes.
That is a recent topic. That was not seen as a topic that was necessarily important to study until the last few years. I'm trying to think if something came out right now. I can't remember. A woman came out a few years ago. I can't remember where she teaches. Wrote a book called School Lunch Politics, and it was about the history of U.S. legislation that created the school lunch program and all the complexities of the commodities, surplus commodities that were then used for school lunches. A really interesting book. Jan Poppendieck came out with a book a couple of years ago, really fascinating book that takes a different approach, more of an ethnographic, sociological approach at school lunch. Really, really great. I can't remember the name of it. School Lunch Politics. We have a graduate student in our department who's taking another look at the history of school lunch. I did a little bit of work on it, but it wasn't, and this is a great example of, it's not until kind of a problem pops up in the general ether that people think to study it historically. So it wasn't until the last 10 or 15 years that kind of we woke up to the fact that we had a severe problem with school lunch and all of the issues going on with soda and nutrition and just a total mess. And then people said, well, wow, we should study this historically and see how we got to this point. Really just a great pieces of research that are helping us understand where we are today.
My question is more back into the writing question in terms of the history of food and health. Because how do you discern or how do you find reliable sources? Because with the internet and I've even had books that I've looked at that, and I'm from Los Angeles, so there's a lot of people who have their ideas about what food history is that probably is not accurate, and I have had arguments about these things. How do you find reliable sources for, what you're interested with food when there is so much, wishy-washy stuff out there?
I think I would start out with a book that you like and see what they're citing and what their bibliography is. It's sort of old-fashioned and somewhat non-internet-like, but I find that other people's, you must have some books that you do think are reliable or seem to be reflective and not simply statements of this will kill you or 5 people have died in Arizona because of that. And then, see what they are citing, see what their bibliography says, and then look at what the bibliographies of those books say. And then I think you will find that you'll have a kind of dossier of reasonably reliable things. The other thing that the internet does, of course, is that it has contestation or answers. In other words, for people who make assertions, there are people who make contrary assertions. And I think you can navigate your way around things that seem to be controversial enough so that they can't be determined to be reliable. But it is a subject about which there's a lot of fascinating and an awful lot of unreliable material. And therefore, perhaps it is something in which, I don't want to exaggerate the benefits of academic writing, but academic writing has to go through certain kinds of hoops of peer review that with topics like that might make it more reliable.
There was the lady here. And then Eve.
I wondered if anyone could talk about whether you think that the sustainable food movement can actually scale up, now it's sort of scattered. Can it scale up to be a force that would actually overthrow the industrial food system and, that we would go back to small-scale farming, no chemicals, no pesticides, no GMOs? Do you envision that could ever happen in the U.S.?
Well, the great thing about history is it's always 2020, right? And the future is never like that. So I do a lot of work on sustainable food issues. Who gets to decide what should happen and how? That's a big set of questions. And for whose benefit and why? I think we have a lot of questions to answer, both within sort of individual communities and nations and the globe. And I think personally, having done a lot of research on this and teaching about it, the most important issue, I think, about the global food system, and it'd be really interesting to see what Maya and other people think, if you want to talk about a sustainable food system in the future, is the consolidation of every aspect of the food system, so that you have lost just a lot of ability for small the capacity to do small, right? We can say we want small scale, but it's not actually viable for a lot of different reasons, for economic reasons, for regulatory reasons. So I think, why that's emerged over time and why we have that as a particular set of conditions, and then what we would want to have to do for the future, I think that would be very important.
And I would actually look at it from the grower's perspective and say that for something like that to be possible, I don't know if it is possible, but if it were possible, it would take a lot more people willing to grow food. And farming and growing food can be really, really, really hard, and most people don't want to do it. So if that's going to happen, a lot more people have to go out there and garden and start farms, and it's tough. And cook, most importantly.
My question has to do with taste, and my research has to do with how people decorate their homes, so I mean that kind of taste, and particularly the kind of taste that you sort of imagine in food studies. So to get at that, I want to ask a sort of provocative and devilish question, which is, in food studies, is it theoretically possible that American cheese could ever taste good?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. If you are at a baseball game and you go get nachos, do you really want Parmigiano Reggiano sprinkled on top of those chips? Not really. You want maybe not as goopy as what they're going to put on it, but kind of that Velveeta texture with a few jalapenos on it. It has its place in the landscape of food, I think. A lot, and what the question you're asking is the contextualization of taste, and taste absolutely has context. Taste is so complicated, which makes it so interesting. It's this combination of physiology, culture, unique individual preference and experience, and it's so hard to get a handle on it. But we know that things taste different in different contexts, and we can be acclimated to things, to like things that we didn't start out liking, and in part that's because of a taste culture around us, taste in that way that you're describing, that makes it desirable. So we can learn to like things that we would in the beginning never thought we would learn to like. And that, I'm a food an equal opportunity food historian. I think that, and this kind of gets to the question of the industrial food supply and is it going to go away? I can't see the industrialized food going away for practical and economic reasons, but it also has a place, I think. I think we all rely on industrial food, and there are industrial tastes that are good. And so, just kind of in the larger landscape of things, I think there's room for, those little ice cream sandwiches that you get in the box that may not be so healthy, but, bring some pleasure and are okay once in a while.
To throw back an equally provocative point, is everybody's tastes equal? Does not someone who knows a great deal more about a subject taste more valid than someone who doesn't? In other words, would you rather go to a dentist to have your teeth drilled, or would you go to your neighbor who has a lot of opinions about your teeth being drilled? Would you rather have an engineer build a bridge, or would you rather have your cousin, Frankie, build the bridge? Not everybody's opinion is equal. And I think that's as true of food as it is of everybody else. So that's my completely elitist opinion on the matter.
Okay. I have been studying how millennials relate to food and food culture today. And there's new research now showing that millennials are defined, at least by me, those born between 1979 and 2000. They're more likely to splurge on artisanal food products. They're more likely to start dinner groups. They're more likely to talk to their friends about food. And I'm just wondering what you credit for kind of starting this whole phenomenon of kind of food hysteria.
again, I'm not going to make any pronouncements. And maybe Paul has some particular ideas. I mean, it's not a hysteria. I mean, again, you're a social group, and you're in a moment in history where a set of ideas are very powerful, and they're a way for you to cohere as a group of saying, this is who I am, this is my identity, and this is how I want to be in the world. And it is very striking. I've had many discussions because I do teach millennials, I guess, a lot, and I'm not a millennial, but I've been very interested in food for a long time, but before sort of this set of ideas. And I said to my friends, I think this is like when I was graduating from college and you'd be really cool if you were a roadie on an indie rock band. You know, like it's something about identity and something about being hip and something about asserting yourself in the context of a complex modern world that you're not sure you really want to say yes to. I don't know, those are my little philosophical.
Yeah, I also teach mostly millennials, and certainly you did notice it around 2000. What surprises me is that I guess I had assumed for a long time that most college students were very changeable and phobic about food. That is, they were dieting, they were vegans one day, gave it up, ate Cheerios for 3 days, binged on something, but that the one thing that was not of interest was the aesthetic qualities of taste. And even when I first started teaching food history, I thought that my constituency were people who were interested in the environmental and sustainable issues. And I was somewhat surprised to discover how much people were, indeed, as you say, interested in dining, in how things are prepared, in restaurants, in food ethnicity, in experiments in travel and food. I think that has a lot to do with travel, greater amount of travel to countries outside of Europe. I think it has a lot to do with television and the Food Channel, even though I know that's sort of heretical, but that just offers a kind of way of thinking about food as pleasurable that I would not have thought, had I not seen it with my own eyes repeatedly, was typical of people in the sort of 15 to 30 age group now.
I'll just add to that. I think the Food Network has done is responsible for a lot of that kind of this combination of interest in food with entertainment, with fascination, with maybe trying it, maybe not, but kind of putting food on the radar and taste on the radar of popular culture. I also found that I think a lot of students came to it through food safety and environment issues. I think Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation and Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma that came out early, mid-2000s, were for a lot of college students kind of touchstone texts in a way that maybe Jack Kerouac's On the Road was a transformative book for an earlier generation that kind of just changed their thinking, kind of changed priorities, changed interests. And so I found that it's a convergence of taste, nutrition, food safety, the environment, kind of all, that were kind of disparate streams coming together and kind of making sense, wrapped up in pleasure and commensality and culture, that's not frivolous, that's an integral part of all of these issues.
We have time for a couple of more questions.
I was really interested in the discussion earlier and that drifted around polenta and the way that it's been used. And on the one hand, I really agreed with the sentiment that I think was being expressed, that maybe it doesn't matter what the truth is, it's how this is sort of rallied around culturally, which is really interesting. And on the other hand, in our own country, I've been frustrated with a couple conversations in the past few months around pizza as a vegetable and pink slime, and these terms have just taken on a life of their own. So on the one hand, I see the validity of this, the truth being deeper than the truth itself, and on the other hand, there's this sort of the truth is written by the victors, and I wonder as food scholars how you balance those two notions as you study them.
I came to some of my interest in food through studying peasants in the Middle Ages and the image of peasants in the eyes of clerical and aristocratic and town observers. And one of the things that you find again and again is a stereotyping on the basis of the food they eat. The food they eat is disgusting. It's root vegetables, dairy products, gruel. And of course you can think of some of the same sorts of stereotypes made of the food of poor people or of minorities in the eyes of the affluent in American history as well. That certain foods are stereotyped as African American or as poor or as lowly, and not just because the people are poor, but because they actually like food that is disapproved of by the upper classes. So I agree there's a real content to this, and it's not new. What is new is, of course, the vocabulary of what's considered to be lowly. And this gets back to the American cheese question. You know, when white bread and American cheese first came out, they were prestigious because they were not made by, untucked by human hands. They were hygienic. They were the food of the future. They were non-fussy. They didn't involve standing around all day and cooking stuff. They were for people who had better things to do, build dams, interstate highways, and they were advertised that way. And indeed, people who spent all day cooking were typed as, not American and not streamlined and not with it, so that what is prestigious changes. And beyond the mere, banal fact of that, it changes in ways that can still retain this sense that what I eat is superior to what other people eat, and vice versa, that our food preferences show our relative superiority or inferiority.
One last question. Oh, 1 second.
I just wanted to add to that one of the beautiful things about studying food history is that it allows you to study the narrative of not the winners, of the peasants. By looking at food texts, you can actually get at the history that wasn't written by the sort of the elitist or whoever won. So it's one of the beautiful things about studying that particular topic. It allows you access to that.
And the main group that has not been historically studied, who has been the main group involved in almost all food production throughout history, of course, is women. And it may be that the reason that the history of food was looked down upon by mainstream academia for as long as it was because it was one of those women's things, much like fashion and much like, a bunch of other topics we could talk about, but like shopping, right?
Yeah. All right. First of all, thanks to our panelists. I think it was really interesting. Thank you for participating. Again, if you're interested, the 6 volumes we've been talking about are right there, so you can look at them. And if you want to have more information about our events, please leave your email at the door, and we'll be happy to keep you informed. Thank you.